And I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the 26th of May, the Syrians raised their voices loudly and gave a clear message to the whole world that it must acknowledge the choice of the Syrian people who supported the re-election of Dr. Bashar al-Assad as President of the Syrian Arab Republic by an absolute majority of votes. The significant success in achieving this national constitutional entitlement and the impressive public participation within Syria and outside of the country have clearly demonstrated the Syrians' upholding of the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of their country and of their independent national choices. They have also demonstrated the support of the Syrians, of their leadership and rejection of occupation practices, terrorism, sanctions, pressure, and dictations, which are still being defended and glossed over by deceptive slogans by some countries within the Council and beyond it. The results announced by the Speaker of the People's Assembly, the Parliament, in the Syrian Arab Republic showed that Dr. Bashar al-Assad had obtained an absolute majority of votes with a percentage of 95.1% of the number of valid votes. The Supreme Constitutional Court also indicated that the total number of voters who are entitled to vote inside and outside the Syrian Arab Republic is 18,107,109 voters, while the total number of voters who voted at home and abroad reached 14,239,140 voters, which represents a percentage of 78.64% of those eligible to vote. Mr. President, there are statements that mix between this entitlement and the provisions of Resolution 2254 are misleading or is misleading. We mentioned that the carrying out of the presidential elections is a fulfillment of a constitutional entitlement that aims at the continuity of the Syrian state and the function of its institutions to guard against any constitutional vacuum. Therefore, there is no link between the elections and Resolution 2254. The insistence of some countries not to heed the voice of the Syrian people and not to abandon their wrong policies in Syria and in the Arab region has only brought terrorism, chaos, the instability, insecurity, plundering of wealth and devastation of the lives and welfare of civilians. Therefore, we call on these countries to conduct an honest and genuine review of the catastrophic repercussions of their policies and to put an end to their practices that violate the principles of international law, the provisions of the UN Charter, and the fundamentals of friendly relations between states. Mr. President, my country, Syria, is committed to the political solution underpinned by Syrian national dialogue that is Syrian-owned, Syrian-led, and has been positively engaging in working to achieve it and provide its support and facilities to ensure its success. With full commitment and upholding of the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. This is a firm and well-established principle that cannot be ceded. In this context, the Syrian government continues to follow up on the efforts of the Special Envoy, Mr. Geir Pedersen, as facilitator of this process and looks forward to holding the 6th round of the Constitutional Committee to discuss the Constitution soon, stressing the need not to interfere in its work or try to impose artificial timetables or preconceived conclusions for its work. We also affirm that Syria, represented by its national team in the Constitutional Committee, has responded to all the requirements for the continuation of the work of this committee as presented by Mr. Pedersen, and there is no need for any party to distort facts, falsify what has been agreed, and complicates the work of this committee through pretexts that do not stand up to facts. We stress that any attempt in this direction aims at putting obstacles to the work of the committee and preventing its progress. Mr. President, within the framework of the efforts of the Syrian government to establish national reconciliation and settle the conditions of detainees, the President of the Republic issued on May 2nd Legislative Decree number 13 that grants a general amnesty to perpetrators of misdemeanors, violations, and felonies occurring before the date of its issuance, which comes within a series of decrees that have been issued in this regard. Dozens of detainees in a number of towns in the countryside of Damascus, including Douma, Erbil, Kafr Batna, and others, have been also released. The Syrian government has continued to make every effort to secure the release of the hostages and abductees held by terrorist organizations and to ensure their safe return to their families. Unfortunately, these efforts were met with the Turkish regime's repudiation of its commitments under the Astana process and its obstruction of any progress in conducting serious exchanges. By deliberately reducing the number of hostages and abductees proposed to be exchanged, it is unacceptable that some members of this council deal selectively and discriminately with this humanitarian issue by continuing to level accusations to the Syrian authorities, ignoring the existence of hostages and abductees held by terrorist organizations and their various entities, and the need to uncover the fate of thousands of missing persons in the areas controlled by these organizations. Mr. President, my delegation has continued to brief the Security Council and the Secretariat on the aggressive practices carried out by the occupying forces of the United States and Turkey on the territory of my country in cooperation with their proxy separatist militias and terrorist entities. It also continues to report on the repeated Israeli attacks, all of which constitute flagrant violations of international law and the provisions of the UN Charter, as well as the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syrian Arab Republic, as affirmed by all relevant resolutions on the situation in Syria. In this context, on behalf of my country's government, I address to you official letters about the conduct of the governments of a number of Western countries, including 3 permanent members of this council. They commit violations of the sovereignty of my country and seeking to establish an illegal and artificial status quo through their support for separatist militias and the infiltration of their delegations like thieves into Syrian territory without the permission or prior approval of the Syrian government, the most recent of which is the U.S. delegation headed by the Acting Assistant Secretary of State. In this respect, I would like to ask, is it permissible for U.S. forces to cross the Iraqi-Syrian border as if they were crossing New York to New Jersey, looting Syrian oil and Syrian wheat, as well as killing Syrians in a flagrant defiance of the resolutions of this Council and the Charter of the United Nations? Does this behavior reflect a commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria by a country that is supposed to be entrusted with contributing to the maintenance of international peace and security. My country, during the upcoming period, will submit a request to compel the United States to pay the value of what it has stolen of oil, wheat, and other wealth belonging to the Syrian state, based on the principle of accountability, and to compensate the Syrian people for what they have lost as a result of looting of their wealth by the United States. We also address to you dozens of letters regarding the Erdogan regime's policies of sponsoring terrorist organizations and its Turkification of practices in the areas it occupies in north and northwest Syria by changing their demographic and administrative character, raising the Turkish flag over the government offices and service institutions, and appointing a wali or governor and Turkish government employees to supervise them, confiscate lands, build the so-called separation wall, change the names of roads and public squares, and give them Turkish and Ottoman names. This comes in addition to its Turkification of school curricula, school documents, and license plates, the operation of Turkish telecommunications and postal companies, linking electric power grids to the Turkish grid, imposing dealing in the Turkish lira instead of the Syrian pound, not to mention preventing the work of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent in the humanitarian field and replacing it with the Red Turkish Crescent. The question is, how long will this council continue to remain silent on the violations of the Turkish regime that are covered up by its NATO allies? Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to note that after 10 years of the failure of the aggressive practices of some countries, which have become known to all and which completely contradicted their claims of concern for respecting Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity, achieving a political solution, and supporting the restoration of security and stability to Syria? Is it not time for these countries to review their policies and consider realistically the results of their hostile practices against Syria in particular and the region in general? Is it not time for these countries to lift their inhumane siege on Syria and to put an end to their unilateral coercive measures that have denied Syrians their livelihoods and benefit from their country's wealth? Is it not time for them to follow the path of political dialogue and diplomacy to address differences instead of following the path of aggression, threats of force, pressure, and imposition of diktats and coercive measures? I thank you, Mr.